Picture 13,000 men. They step out of the tree line in near perfect order, a wall of gray nearly a mile wide, battle flags up, bayonets catching the hot July sun. In front of them, 3/4 of a mile of open field. Not a tree, not a ditch, nothing to hide behind. And at the far end, a low ridge bristling with Union cannon, loaded and waiting. They begin to walk. This is the moment the entire Confederacy has been building toward for 2 years, the roll of the dice for everything. And in about 20 minutes, it will be the moment the dream starts to die. This is Gettysburg. And to understand how it happened, you can't just look at the field. You have to look at one man, the man who sent those 13,000 across it. Because the truth about Gettysburg is that the South wasn't really beaten by the North here. It was beaten by the one flaw in the greatest soldier of the war. By the summer of 1863, Robert E. Lee was the closest thing the war had to a living legend. He had taken a smaller, poorer, outnumbered army and humiliated one Union general after another. He had just pulled off his masterpiece at Chancellorsville, splitting his army in the face of a force twice his size and shattering it. Yes, he had lost Stonewall Jackson there, but the aura around Lee himself had only grown. His soldiers believed he could not lose. They would walk into anything if he asked. And here is the dangerous part, the quiet poison at the heart of all that success. Lee was starting to believe it too. Now, to be fair to him, Lee understood the South's problem better than almost anyone. He knew that even while he was winning battles, the South was losing the larger war. The blockade was tightening. The North had more men, more factories, more of everything. And it could replace its losses, while he could not. Time was the enemy. A long war was a war the South would lose. So Lee made a fateful decision. He would gamble. He would march his army north, out of Virginia, into Pennsylvania, and force one enormous, dramatic victory on Northern soil. A victory so shocking it might break the North's will to fight, embolden the peace movement, and finally win the South its independence in one blow. It was bold. It was desperate. And it was exactly the kind of swing-for-the-fences move that had always worked for him before. In June of 1863, the Army of Northern Virginia marched north. Here's the strange part. Nobody planned to fight at Gettysburg. It was just a small Pennsylvania town where a dozen roads happened to cross. The brand new commander of the Union Army, a careful general named George Meade, who had been in charge for all of 3 days, was racing to find Lee. Lee's scattered army was racing to pull itself together, and they bumped into each other, almost by accident. Once the first shots were fired, the battle pulled in more and more men, like a fire feeding itself, until the two greatest armies on the continent were locked together around that little town. It became the largest, bloodiest battle ever fought in North America. Day one went beautifully for the South. The Confederates came in from the north and west and drove the outnumbered Union troops back, through the fields, through the streets of the town, in apparent triumph. To Lee, riding onto the field, it must have looked like another Chancellorsville in the making. But it was a trap with no one setting it. Because as the Union soldiers fell back, They fell back onto the high ground south of town, a long fishhook of hills and ridges. Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, Cemetery Ridge. And there, on that high ground, they stopped running, and they dug in. That high ground would become the graveyard of the Confederate cause. On day 2, Lee went on the attack, hammering both ends of the Union fishhook in some of the most savage fighting of the entire war. The names of those places became legend. Little Round Top, the wheat field, the peach orchard. Men fought and died over a few hundred yards of rock and grass. Again and again, the Confederates came within a breath of breaking through. Consider just one of them. At the far southern end of the Union line stood a steep, rocky hill called Little Round Top, and it was almost undefended. Lee's men saw it. If they could seize that hill, they could haul their cannon to the summit and fire straight down the length of the entire Union line, rolling it up from the end. It was the kind of opening that wins battles and ends wars. Confederate troops surged up the slope, and at the very top, a small band of Union soldiers, out of ammunition, about to be overrun, did the one thing. When night fell on day 2, the Union Army was battered and bloodied, but it was still there, still on the high ground, still unbroken. This is the moment everything turned on, and it's where Lee's flaw became fatal. His most trusted commander, James Longstreet, came to him and begged him not to do what he was about to do. "Don't attack that ridge head-on," Longstreet pleaded. "The center is strong. The ground is open. We'll be slaughtered. Instead, swing around the Union Army, get between them and Washington, and force them to attack us on ground of our choosing." It was wise advice. It was almost certainly right. And Lee said no. His blood was up. He had watched these men do the impossible too many times to believe they couldn't do it again. He looked at the Union center, the middle of the line, on Cemetery Ridge, and he became convinced that one massive, concentrated blow could crack it open and win the war. Longstreet was so sure it was doomed that he could barely bring himself to give the order. But Lee was the commander, and Lee had decided. On the afternoon of day 3, it began with the largest artillery barrage the continent had ever heard. Over 150 guns trying to soften the Union center. For almost 2 hours, the earth itself shook. Men on both sides pressed themselves flat into the dirt as the world came apart above them, the air screaming with iron. And then the cannon fell silent, and 13,000 men stepped out of the trees. You know this part now. The mile of open ground, the Union artillery opening up, tearing holes in the gray lines, the rifle fire cutting men down by the hundreds. And still they came, closing the gap, climbing toward that low stone wall on the ridge. A handful of them reached it. For one moment, a few hundred Confederates breached the Union line. That spot is remembered forever as the high water mark of the Confederacy, the furthest point the Southern tide would ever reach. And there, it broke. The charge collapsed in blood and smoke and ruin. More than half the men who walked into that field never walked out. Whole regiments simply ceased to exist. The general whose name the charge would carry, George Pickett, was never the same, and never forgave Lee for it. And as the broken survivors came streaming back across that field, Robert E. Lee rode out among them. He did not blame his men. He did not blame the enemy. He rode through the wreckage of his own army, saying over and over the most honest and most crushing words of his life. "It is all my fault." The next day was the 4th of July, and Lee began the long, painful retreat back to Virginia. But the South's worst day wasn't over, because the disaster came in two. That very same day, 1,000 miles to the west, the great Confederate fortress of Vicksburg surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant after a brutal siege. 30,000 men gone, and with them the entire Mississippi River fell into Union hands, splitting the Confederacy clean in two. In a single week, the South lost its aura of invincibility in the East and its lifeline in the West. Gettysburg is called the turning point of the war, and it was, but not for the reason people usually think. The South wasn't finished. It would fight on ferociously for almost 2 more years. What died at Gettysburg wasn't the Confederate Army. It was the dream, the belief that the South could actually win. After this, the war stopped being about victory. It became about survival. And here's the hard lesson buried in those 3 days. The very thing that made Lee great is the thing that destroyed his army. The boldness, the audacity, the refusal to play it safe. It had won him everything. And on Cemetery Ridge, pushed one step too far, it cost him everything. The qualities that bring triumph, taken too far, bring ruin. So picture it one last time. A low stone wall on a ridge in Pennsylvania. That is the high water mark, the furthest the gray tide would ever reach. From this moment on, for the Confederacy, every step is a step backward. Next time, from the Southern perspective, we'll follow that long retreat. As the noose slowly tightens, the blockade strangles, and the proud, doomed South begins its final, grinding fight for survival.